The war against the Devourers lasted 8 months, and ended not with humanity's defeat but with their complete and total victory. Every Devourer construct had been destroyed. Every harvesting fleet scattered, every world killer weapon turned against its creators. The galaxy was safe, but safety had come with a price that no civilization had ever paid before. The awakened humans could not turn off what they had become. The psychological modifications that made them perfect warriors also made them incapable of existing in peacetime. They needed conflict like other beings needed oxygen. They craved battle with an addiction stronger than any biological dependency. Their brain chemistry had been permanently altered to require strategic planning and tactical challenges. Commander Jin Wu, one of the few humans who had resisted the awakening process, stood before the Galactic Council's final emergency session. The chamber was different now, larger and more heavily fortified because the other species had learned to fear what their human allies had become. Around him sat the survivors of 100 different species. Their faces showed expressions that mixed gratitude and terror in equal measure. They owed their lives to humanity, but they also understood that 50,000 awakened humans represented a threat that might be worse than the Devourers had ever been. The Devourer threat is ended, Jin Wu reported, his voice carrying the weight of knowledge that no one wanted to hear. Our forces have confirmed the destruction of their primary construction facilities, their mobile fleets, and their command networks. The galaxy is clear of their presence, but Elder Kethra's crystalline form flickered with patterns that indicated she already suspected what was coming next. What of the awakened humans, she asked, though her voice suggested she feared the answer. Jin Wu looked around the chamber at beings who had trusted humanity for 3 centuries, and now wondered if that trust had been the biggest mistake in galactic history. We have a new problem, he said simply. 50,000 awakened humans with nothing left to fight. The reports from human-controlled sectors painted a picture that terrified every military analyst in the galaxy. The awakened humans had begun fighting among themselves, creating elaborate war games that used entire star systems as battlefields. They established competing factions and engaged in conflicts that treated civilian populations as strategic resources. Dr. Hai Jin, now serving as the primary liaison between awakened and normal humans, presented psychological profiles that showed the depth of the problem. The transformation process could not be reversed. The genetic modifications were permanent. The brain chemistry changes were irreversible. The awakened humans were trapped in mental states that required constant conflict. They are not evil, she explained to the council, though her own transformation made her voice carry an edge that had not been there before. They retain their memories, their love for their families, their desire to protect innocent life. But they also carry the accumulated military knowledge of 10,000 years of human warfare. They cannot shut it off. Captain Min Ho stood at attention as he delivered his final report as a military officer. The awakened human forces had grown beyond their original numbers as more volunteers underwent the transformation process. Each new awakening added to their tactical capabilities, but also increased the instability of their psychological profiles. We have established 17 different military commands across 12 star systems, he reported. Each command operates independently with its own strategic objectives and resource requirements. Conflict between commands has become inevitable as they compete for territory and objectives. The solution they reached was unprecedented in galactic history, but it was the only option that offered any hope of controlling what humanity had unleashed. The awakened humans would be given their own sector of space far from civilian populations. They would be provided with resources and support, but they would remain isolated until someone could figure out how to reverse the transformation process. It is not exiled, Jin Wu explained as he signed the documents that would separate his species into 2 distinct populations. It is quarantine. We saved the galaxy, but we sacrificed our humanity to do it until we can find a way back to what we were. We are too dangerous to live among civilized beings. The evacuation took 3 months. Every awakened human was relocated to the Outer Rim territories where they could establish their own civilization without threatening the species they had saved. Transport ships carried 50,000 beings who looked human, but thought like living weapons to worlds where they could build whatever kind of society Their altered minds required Dr. Hyjin prepared to join the isolated sector. Despite offers to remain with normal human society, her transformation was less complete than the others, but she still carried genetic modifications that made peaceful existence difficult. I helped create them, she said as she boarded the final transport ship. I cannot abandon them now. The last message from the isolated sector came 6 months after the evacuation. It was brief and encoded in military frequencies that required special equipment to decode. We are adapting it, said we are building. We are becoming something new. Whether that something is better or worse than what we were remains to be seen. Elder Kethera floated in her meditation chamber, looking out at stars that were safe because 50,000 humans had chosen to become monsters. The mathematical certainty of extinction had been replaced by the uncertainty of survival. But uncertainty was not the same as safety. Did we make the right choice? She asked Captain Min Ho during one of their regular meetings. Min Ho, who had remained unawakened, studied reports from the isolated sector where his former comrades were establishing a civilization based on principles that violated every treaty in galactic history. We are alive, he said. Finally, our species survive. Our cultures continue. Whether that was worth the price we paid. He paused, looking at displays that showed the isolated sector expanding as more humans volunteered for awakening and joined their transformed comrades. Ask me in 100 years, when we see what the awakened humans become. The galaxy was safe, the devourers were gone, civilization would continue. But in the far reaches of space, 50,000 awakened humans built their own version of human society, a society that remembered what it meant to survive when survival was the only law that mattered. Some called them heroes who had saved the galaxy. Others called them monsters who had abandoned their humanity. They called themselves what they had always been: human, but they were a kind of human that the galaxy had never seen before. And in the deepest levels of their new worlds, they established archives similar to the one that had awakened them, archives that contained the knowledge and memories of what they had been before. The transformation records of gentle people who had chosen peace over victory and cooperation over conquest, because even monsters sometimes remembered being human, and sometimes in the quiet moments between conflicts they wondered if the price of victory had been too high to pay. But the galaxy was safe, and for beings who had sacrificed their souls to preserve life, that would have to be enough. The awakened humans waited in their isolated sector, building weapons that could crack reality itself and strategies that could defeat gods. They waited for the galaxy to need them again, because they knew that somewhere in the dark between stars new threats were stirring, and when those threats came, the galaxy would call upon the monsters that humanity had chosen to become. The awakened humans would answer that call, because saving the galaxy was what they had been made to do, even if it cost them everything they had once been. 6 weeks after the first awakening, 50,000 humans had undergone the transformation process. The hidden refugee base had become something that would make the galaxy's greatest military powers retreat in terror. Every corridor hummed with activity as awakened humans moved with mechanical precision, turning every resource into an instrument of destruction. The medical facilities now produced autonomous war drones instead of healing supplies. The educational centers had become psychological warfare training grounds. The agricultural sections manufactured biological weapons alongside food production. Even the children's playgrounds had been converted into testing areas for new tactical equipment. Engineer Kyung Soo stood before the council of species representatives, presenting his latest creation with obvious pride and carefully hidden horror. His voice was calm and clinical as he described modifications that violated 17 different galactic warfare treaties. We have converted the atmospheric processing plant into a planetary scale weapon system, he explained while holographic displays showed the technical specifications. Every air recycler can now produce toxic compounds. Every atmospheric vent has been weaponized for chemical deployment. The alien observers watched in fascination and growing terror as humans demonstrated innovations that redefined the concept of warfare: mining equipment that could destabilize tectonic plates, civilian transport ships that had been turned into kinetic bombardment platforms, communication satellites that could broadcast mind control frequencies. Ambassador Vel Tar pressed herself against the back wall of the chamber, as if trying to escape from what she was seeing. This is madness, she whispered, her translator struggling with concepts. Her peaceful species had never needed words for you, are turning your entire civilization into a weapon of mass destruction, Captain. Minho, now awakened and serving as strategic coordinator, looked at her with eyes that held no warmth. Every human civilization has always been a weapon, he said with casual indifference. We just got very good at pretending otherwise for 300 years. The difference now is that we have stopped pretending and started remembering. The psychological profiles of the awakened humans showed changes that Dear Haijin found deeply disturbing. They displayed addiction-level dependency on conflict and strategic planning. Their brain chemistry had altered to require combat scenarios the way normal beings needed food and sleep. They could not exist in peaceful environments without experiencing withdrawal symptoms, but their effectiveness was undeniable. In 6 weeks, they had transformed a refugee shelter into a military installation that could challenge galactic superpowers. Their innovations in warfare technology had advanced by centuries in mere days. They had rediscovered weapons and tactics that had been deliberately forgotten by civilized society. The first major test came when long-range sensors detected a devourer harvesting fleet entering the outer regions of the Kepler system. Intelligence analysis suggested the fleet contained over 200 massive constructs, each one capable of consuming entire planets. The combined firepower was estimated to be sufficient for destroying 1,000 star systems. The alien species representatives prepared for extinction. They broadcast final messages to distant colonies that would probably never receive them. They held memorial services for civilizations that would soon cease to exist. They made peace with mathematics that showed zero probability of survival, but the awakened humans were not preparing to die. They were preparing to demonstrate why their species had once been considered too dangerous for galactic society. The battle began when the Devourer fleet was still 3 days away from the planet. Captain Su Jin, now promoted to Fleet Admiral, initiated combat operations, using weapons and tactics that existed in no military manual. The first phase involved destabilizing the system's primary star using precisely placed gravitational charges. Most species would have considered using a star as a weapon to be impossible. The energy requirements alone exceeded the total power output of most galactic civilizations, but humans had learned long ago that impossible was just another word for something nobody had been desperate enough to try yet. The gravitational charges were devices that had been developed from mining equipment used to break apart asteroids. By linking hundreds of them together and placing them at precise coordinates around the star, the humans created artificial gravity wells that began to tear the star apart from the inside. The second phase involved weaponizing the planets themselves. Mining equipment that had been designed to extract resources was repurposed to extract entire planetary cores. The molten metal was then shaped into massive projectiles and launched at relativistic speeds toward the approaching Devourer fleet. Phase 3 was the most terrifying, because it demonstrated how completely the humans had abandoned the concept of acceptable casualties. The civilian population was evacuated to the outer moons while the planet itself was converted into a massive bomb. The entire crust was rigged with fusion charges that would turn the world into an expanding sphere of plasma and debris. When the Devourer fleet finally arrived at what had once been the Kepler system, they found themselves facing an enemy that had weaponized the fundamental forces of physics. The star was already collapsing into an unstable neutron configuration. The planets had been turned into kinetic projectiles moving at significant fractions of light speed. The entire system had become a weapons platform. The battle lasted 18 hours and redefined what the galaxy understood about the theoretical limits of warfare. The Devourers had superior technology and overwhelming numbers, but humans fought with a combination of desperation and tactical brilliance that turned every disadvantage into an opportunity. When the first wave of Devourer ships entered the system, they were met by planetary fragments moving at relativistic speeds. The impact of even small debris at those velocities was sufficient to damage constructs that had survived direct hits from antimatter weapons. The second wave tried to avoid the debris field, but found themselves caught in the gravitational distortions caused by the destabilizing star. Space itself had become unreliable, with areas where the normal laws of physics longer applied consistently, the final wave of devourers attempted to retreat but discovered that the humans had mined the approach routes with devices that created temporary black holes. The escape routes that had brought them into the system had become gravitational traps that pulled ships apart at the molecular level. When the battle ended, the Devourer fleet was gone. Every construct destroyed, every harvesting ship reduced to component atoms scattered across light years of space. But the victory had come with a price that made the alien observers question whether survival was worth what they had become. The Kepler system no longer existed. 4 planets had been completely destroyed. 2 moons had been shattered into asteroid fields. The star itself had been reduced to an unstable white dwarf that would burn out within a century. Everything that had made the system capable of supporting life had been sacrificed for military advantage. One elder Kethera said, her crystalline form reflecting the dying light of the destabilized star. Her voice carried tones that indicated she was struggling to process the implications of what she had witnessed. Yes, replied Dr. Hyjin, though she was no longer recognizable as the gentle scientist she had been before the awakening process began. We won the question. Now is whether winning was worth what we have become. The answer to that question would become clear sooner than anyone expected, because 50,000 awakened humans with nothing left to fight were about to discover that peace was no longer an option for beings who had been transformed into living weapons. The galaxy was safe from the devourers, but safety had come with a price that no one had calculated. The humans had saved civilization by abandoning their own. Captain Su Jin stood in the command center of the human sector, and everyone who looked at her felt a chill run down their spine. She moved differently now, like a predator that had just remembered how to hunt. Her eyes cataloged every person in the room, noting their strengths, weaknesses, and potential uses in combat scenarios. Commander Jin Woo tried to keep his voice steady as he gave her the first assignment. A Devourer scout ship had been detected at the edge of the system, moving slowly toward their hidden base. The alien commanders were preparing evacuation procedures, but Su Jin was already studying tactical displays with the intensity of someone who lived for moments like this. Report, he ordered, though his voice carried a tremor. He could not suppress. Su Jin's smile was cold and calculating. I remember everything she said: my first pet, my graduation day, my wedding ceremony, but I also remember the siege of Thermopylae, the Battle of Stalingrad, the nuclear bombing campaigns of the Third Global War. One know 17 different ways to destroy that scout ship, using only the mining equipment we have in the asteroid belt. The scout ship was massive by normal standards, a metal construct the size of a city block with enough firepower to destroy their entire hidden fleet single-handedly. It had already consumed 3 star systems and showed no signs of slowing down. The alien military advisors had calculated that even their combined defensive systems had less than a 5% chance of survival. Negative on evacuation, Su Jin said as her fingers danced across control panels with impossible speed. We are not running anymore. What happened next would be studied in military academies for centuries, assuming any military academies survived what was coming. Su Jin took control of every civilian system in the base and turned them into weapons. Mining lasers became targeting systems, cargo haulers became missile platforms, asteroid processing plants became ammunition factories. She lured the Devourer scout into the asteroid field using false energy signatures that made it believe it was tracking a much larger group of survivors. The machine intelligence was sophisticated, but it had been designed to hunt prey that ran away, not prey that set traps. The scout ship moved deeper into the asteroid field, following energy readings that seemed to indicate thousands of refugee vessels hidden among the rocks. It never occurred to the machine intelligence that the energy signatures were coming from mining equipment that had been repurposed into a massive weapons array. Su Jin waited until the scout was surrounded by asteroids on all sides before she activated her trap. The mining charges that had been placed throughout the field detonated simultaneously, creating a gravitational cascade that pulled the asteroids into a crushing sphere around the Devourer ship. But the trap was just the beginning. As the scout ship tried to break free from the asteroid prison, Su Jin activated the second phase of her attack. The mining lasers had been linked together and focused into a single beam that could cut through the ship's hull. The cargo haulers released their loads of refined metals, creating a cloud of debris that interfered with the ship's sensors. The Devourer scout found itself blind-trapped and under attack from weapons it had not even recognized as threats. Its sophisticated combat systems had been designed to fight military vessels, not mining equipment that had been turned into improvised weapons by someone who understood both warfare and industrial engineering. The entire engagement lasted 4 minutes and 37 seconds. When it was over, the Devourer scout ship had been reduced to scrap metal that would be recycled into more weapons. The machine intelligence that had consumed entire star systems had been defeated by mining equipment and human ingenuity. How? Elder Cathura asked in amazement. Her crystalline form was flickering with patterns that indicated she was struggling to process what she had just witnessed. Su Jin's smile was satisfied and terrifying. Humans do not fight fair, she said. We never have. The moment you decide that winning is more important than honor, the moment you accept that the enemy's destruction is worth any cost, you stop being a civilized being and start being a human at war. Dr. Hyjin watched the psychological readings with growing alarm. The awakening process had worked beyond their most optimistic projections. Su Jin had not just remembered human military tactics. She had integrated them so completely that she could improvise new strategies in real time, using whatever resources were available. But the cost was becoming clear. The woman who had volunteered for the awakening process had been gentle and thoughtful, someone who preferred negotiation to conflict and always looked for peaceful solutions. The person who had emerged from the chamber was someone who saw every problem as a tactical challenge and every resource as a potential weapon. Within days, more awakened humans were emerging from the transformation chambers. Each one carried the same cold efficiency that had made Su Jin so effective. They moved through the base with purpose that bordered on mechanical precision, turning every facility into a component of their growing war. Machine engineer Kyung Soo had been a maintenance specialist before his awakening. Now he stood before the Mixed Species Council presenting modifications that made the alien observers step back in horror. The medical bay had been converted into a drone factory. Every surgical robot could now produce autonomous weapons. Every diagnostic scanner had been reprogrammed for target acquisition. The Children's Education Center had become a training facility for psychological warfare. The food production areas now manufactured chemical weapons alongside nutrition supplements. The communication arrays had been modified to broadcast propaganda and jamming signals that could break enemy morale. This is madness, whispered Ambassador Veltar, her translator, struggling with concepts that her peaceful species had never needed words for. You are turning your entire civilization into a weapon. Captain Minho, now awakened and serving as strategic coordinator, shrugged with casual indifference. Every human civilization has always been a weapon, he said. We just got very good at pretending otherwise. The difference now is that we have stopped pretending. The transformation was accelerating as more humans underwent the awakening process. Each day brought new innovations that violated galactic treaties and civilized conventions. Weapons that used civilian populations as ammunition, tactics that turned entire planets into strategic resources, technologies that could weaponize stars themselves. The alien species watched with growing terror as their human allies became something they no longer recognized. The gentle scholars and peaceful diplomats were being replaced by beings who thought in terms of acceptable casualties and strategic necessities. Every conversation was about logistics and resource management. Every decision was calculated for maximum military advantage. But the first major test was coming. Whether the awakened humans could actually defeat the Devourers or whether they had simply created a different kind of monster remained to be seen. Long-range sensors detected a Devourer harvesting fleet approaching. The system intelligence report suggested it contained enough firepower to destroy 1,000 worlds and had already consumed everything in its path. For the past 6 months, the alien species prepared for the end, broadcasting final messages to colonies that would never receive them, saying goodbye to civilizations that would soon cease to exist. But the humans were ready. And when the enemy arrived, they would discover that humanity had remembered how to be human in the oldest and most terrible sense of the word. The battle would determine not just whether they survived, but whether survival was worth the price they had paid to achieve it. The debate lasted 2 weeks, and every day more red dots appeared on the tactical displays showing devourer fleets moving closer to their hidden sanctuary. The council chamber had become a battlefield of words where species that had been allies for centuries now argued about survival versus morality. Elder Kethera floated in the center of the chamber, her crystalline form cycling through colors that had no names in human language. Patterns of fear and desperation flickered across her surface. As she listened to the same arguments repeated over and over, the mathematical projections had not changed. The devourers would find them in less than 5 months. Captain Min Ho stood before the assembled representatives holding data pads that contained information nobody wanted to hear. His voice was steady, but his hands shook slightly as he presented the latest intelligence reports from their long-range scouts. The devourers have adapted, he announced, and the chamber fell silent. They are no longer consuming systems randomly. They are following energy signatures, tracking our escape routes, learning our patterns. Every refugee ship that fled to this sector has left a trail that leads directly to us. The holographic display showed the enemy's movement patterns over the past month instead of the random destruction they had shown before. The devourer fleets now moved with purpose. They tested different routes and followed the strongest energy signatures. They had learned to hunt, and their prey was hiding in the tunnels beneath Kepler 442. Beer running will only delay the end by months, maybe weeks. Min Ho continued, his voice growing quieter as the implications became clear. They know we are here. They know how we think. They know where we will run. Commander So Min had spent the past week studying the awakening protocols that Dr. Hai Jin had developed. The process was complex and dangerous, involving genetic modification, psychological conditioning, and the removal of mental blocks that had been carefully constructed over centuries. The modifications we made to ourselves 3 centuries ago were not permanent, Hai Jin explained to the assembled council. They were suppressors, not deletions. We can reverse the process and restore the genetic memory that made humans effective warriors. But she paused and looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of beings who would have to live with the consequences. The humans who emerge from this process will not be the same people who went. And they will remember their lives, their families, their reasons for fighting. But they will also remember strategies that consider entire species expendable. Young Ha Na, barely 20 years old and serving as a cultural attach, raised her hand. Her voice was small in the vast chamber. What guarantee do we have that these awakened humans will not become a greater threat than the devourers themselves? The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. It was the fear that every non-human in the chamber carried, the worry that kept them awake at night. The possibility that in saving themselves from one monster they would create another that was even worse. Ho had remained silent through most of the debates, but now he stood, and his voice carried the weight of centuries. None, he said simply, no guarantee at all. The awakened humans will remember how to fight wars that last for generations. They will know strategies that turn entire populations into weapons. They will understand technologies that can crack planets and burn stars. The chamber erupted in frightened chatter as species representatives whispered among themselves. Some called for an immediate evacuation to distant galaxies. Others wanted to continue hiding and hope the devourers would pass them by. A few suggested surrender and pray that the machines would show mercy. But mathematics does not care about hope or prayer. Teho continued. When the noise died down, the devourers will kill everyone in the galaxy within 6 months. That is certain. Awakened humans might kill everyone in the galaxy within 6 years or 60 years. But might is not the same as will. He looked around the chamber, his old eyes reflecting the emergency lighting. Those who choose mathematics over hope will take the certain death. Those who choose hope over mathematics will take the uncertain one. There is no third option. The universe has made that choice for us. Commander Jin Woo had been quiet through the debates, watching his fellow humans and wondering what they were thinking. The awakening process was voluntary, but once it began, there would be no going back. The person who entered the chamber would not be the same person who came out. The vote was closer than it should have been for the only choice that offered any chance of survival. 18 species representatives voted to authorize the awakening. Protocol 12 voted against it. 7 abstained because they could not bring themselves to choose. between certain death and uncertain survival within. Hours of the vote, the first volunteers were entering the awakening chambers. Deep in the human sector of the underground city, medical bays had been converted into transformation centers. Dr. Hai Jin and her team worked around the clock preparing the genetic modification sequences that would unlock 3 centuries of suppressed evolution. The volunteers came from every branch of human society: military officers who understood the cost of war, civilians who had families to protect, scientists who knew that knowledge without the will to use it was worthless, engineers who could turn peaceful technology into weapons of destruction. Captain Su Jin was among the first to volunteer. She had served in the Federation fleet for 15 years and had never fired a shot in anger. Her record showed commendations for peaceful conflict resolution and diplomatic success. But as she lay in the awakening chamber, she knew that peace was a luxury they could no longer afford. The transformation process took 72 hours. During that time, the volunteers' dreams were filled with memories that were not their own battle strategies from wars. They had never fought weapons, they had never used technologies that had been banned for 3 centuries. Their minds expanded to contain knowledge that their ancestors had chosen to forget. While the first group underwent transformation, the rest of the human population prepared for what was coming. Supply depots were converted into armament factories, medical facilities became weapons research centers. Civilian transport ships were modified with armor and weapon systems that violated dozens of galactic treaties. The other species watched with growing unease as humans moved with a purpose and efficiency that seemed almost mechanical. Every conversation was about logistics and resource allocation. Every decision was measured against its military value. The gentle, scholarly people they had known for 3 centuries were becoming something else. They are high. Jin monitored the psychological readings from the awakening chambers with growing concern. The process was working better than their most optimistic projections. The volunteers were not just remembering human military history, they were integrating it into their personalities, becoming living embodiments of humanity's warrior past. But integration came with a cost. The awakened humans showed changes in brain chemistry that suggested addiction to conflict and competition. Their psychological profiles indicated an inability to exist in peaceful environments. They needed enemies the way other beings needed food and water. On the 3rd day, the first awakened human stepped out of the transformation chamber. Captain Su Jin looked exactly the same, but everyone in the observation deck took an involuntary step backward. Something fundamental had changed in the way she moved, the way she looked at her surroundings, the way she calculated threats and opportunities. Her smile was sharp enough to cut steel, and when she spoke, her voice carried an edge that had not been there before. I remember everything she said, my childhood, my family, my reasons for being here, but I also remember things I never learned: ways to turn mining equipment into siege weapons, how to use civilian populations as intelligence networks, methods for breaking enemy morale that do not require firing a single shot. She paused and looked around the observation deck, cataloging faces and calculating loyalties. I understand now why our ancestors chose to forget. We were very good at making war too good. The galaxy is fortunate that we decided to become something else, but the galaxy's fortune was about to change, and everyone in the observation deck knew it. The first awakened human was ready, and 49,990. 9 more were waiting their turn. The transformation of humanity had begun, and there would be no going back. The emergency alarms had been screaming for 3 days now, and nobody could make them stop. The sound bounced off the metal walls of the underground bunker like angry wasps trapped in a jar. Commander Jin Woo pressed his hands against his ears, but the noise followed him everywhere he went. Deep beneath the surface of planet Kepler 442b, the last survivors of the galaxy huddled together like frightened children. The great cities that once touched the clouds were gone. The proud fleets that patrolled 1,000 star systems were destroyed. Everything that made the galaxy beautiful and alive had been eaten by machines that came from the dark. Between stars, Jin Woo walked through the crowded tunnels where aliens from dozens of worlds pressed together in spaces meant for half their number. The air smelled of fear, sweat, and recycled oxygen that had been breathed too many times. The Tellurians with their blue skin looked like living statues. The crystalline Vorthak clicked and chimed. Their worry songs, the furry Kalani, hugged their children close and whispered prayers in languages that might die with them. At the center of the underground maze stood the council chamber, where the galaxy's last leaders tried to pretend they still had power. The great dome that once held representatives from 10,000 worlds now echoed with the voices of 43 beings from 12 species. Most of the chairs sat empty, like tombstones marking civilizations that no longer existed. Elder Kethera floated at the center of the chamber, her crystal body flickering with patterns that meant stress and fear in her people's language. She was 300 years old and had seen the rise and fall of empires, but nothing had prepared her for this. The mathematical projections floating in the air around her told a story that nobody wanted to hear. 6 months, the numbers said. 6 months before the Devourers found their hiding place. 6 months before the last free beings in the galaxy joined the trillions who had already died. The machines were getting smarter, learning to track energy signatures and follow escape routes. They no longer consumed planets randomly. They hunted with purpose. Dr. Hai-Jin sat in the human section, clutching her datapad with white knuckles. She was a small woman with kind eyes who had spent her life studying alien cultures and helping different species understand each other. Now she stared at information that could save everyone or destroy what little remained of civilized society. Her hands shook as she read the classified files that only 5 humans had ever seen. The Devourers had appeared at the galaxy's edge 20 years ago. Nobody knew where they came from or what they wanted. They looked like massive metal spiders the size of cities, with legs that could crack planets and mouths that swallowed suns. They moved through space in swarms of thousands, eating everything in their path. Stars went dark, worlds turned to dust, entire solar systems vanished as if they had never existed. At first, the galaxy's great powers tried to fight. The hegemony sent fleets of 1,000,000 ships. The Federation launched weapons that could destroy moons. The ancient Ascended used technologies that bent reality itself. Nothing worked. The Devourers absorbed every attack and grew stronger. Their numbers increased with every world they consumed. The retreat began after the Battle of Proxima 7, where 200 billion beings died in a single day. Military commanders who had never known defeat ordered their fleets to run. Civilians who had lived in peace for centuries grabbed what they could carry and fled to the outer rim. Entire species abandoned their homeworlds and scattered across the galaxy like seeds in the wind. Now those seeds had sprouted in one last desperate garden. The planet Kepler 442b had been chosen for its location in a dead system with no resources worth taking. Its underground cities had been expanded into a maze of tunnels and chambers that could hide millions. The best scientists had worked for years to mask their energy signatures and create false readings that would confuse Devourer scouts, but the math did not lie. The projections showed red dots spreading across their tactical displays like drops of blood. Each dot represented a consumed system, and they were getting closer. The pattern was clear. The Devourers had learned to hunt, and they were following the trail of refugee ships back to their source commander. So Min stood at Jinwoo's shoulder, studying the same displays that haunted his dreams. She was younger than him, with quick eyes and steady hands that never shook even when the world was ending. Her security clearance could access weapons that could crack planets, but she had never heard of the files that Hai-Jin carried. The chamber erupted in arguments, as it did every day. Species that had been allies for centuries now blamed each other for their shared doom. The Vorthak wanted to dig deeper. Underground, the Kalani proposed fleeing to the Andromeda galaxy. The Talorians suggested surrendering and hoping the Devourers would be merciful. Nobody mentioned that mercy was a concept the machines had never shown. Through it all, the humans sat quietly. Jinwoo watched his people and wondered what they were thinking. Humans had joined the Galactic Federation 300 years ago. As a young species that needed guidance, they had been taught to be peaceful, to solve problems with words instead of weapons, to build instead of destroy. The other species had helped them bury their violent past and become something better. But buried did not mean gone. Hai-Jin stood slowly, her chair scraping against the metal floor. The sound cut through the arguments like a blade, and suddenly the chamber fell silent. 43 of the galaxy's last leaders turned to look at one small human woman. who held secrets that could change everything. Her voice was quiet, but it carried in the sudden stillness. "There's one option we have not discussed," she said, and her words hung in the recycled air like smoke from a fire that had burned out. Long ago, Elder Kethra's crystal form brightened with curiosity and hope. "What option, child? What have we missed?" In our calculations, Hai Jin looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of beings whose species might not exist tomorrow. Some were desperate enough to try anything. Others were too tired to care anymore. A few, like Jinwoo, seemed to understand that whatever she was about to say would change them all forever. "The human delegation has been holding classified information," she said slowly. "We kept it secret because the Federation asked us to bury it, but if we are truly facing extinction, then perhaps it is time to dig up what we buried 3 centuries ago." The chamber was so quiet that they could hear the life support systems cycling air through the tunnels. The emergency alarms had finally stopped screaming, but the silence was somehow worse. "What did you bury?" asked Elder Kethra, though something in her voice suggested she already suspected the answer. Hai Jin's grip tightened on her datapad. "The proof of what humans were before we learned to be civilized, the reason it took 40 years for our application to join the Federation to be approved, the reason we have never been allowed to serve in offensive military operations." She looked around the chamber one more time, seeing fear and hope warring in alien faces that had trusted humanity. "For 3 centuries, we buried the fact that humans are very, very good at making war." The silence stretched on and on, broken only by the distant hoof of machines keeping them all alive in their underground tomb. Jinwoo felt something cold settle in his stomach as he realized that their last hope might be the one thing they had all agreed should never be unleashed. Again, outside the chamber in the tunnels where millions of beings waited for news, the emergency lights flickered red against metal walls, casting shadows that looked like the shapes of things that hunted in the dark between stars. 3 days after the emergency council meeting, Jin Woo found himself walking through tunnels he had never seen before. The human sector of the underground city was older than the rest, with walls that remembered when Earth first reached for the stars. The metal here was different, darker, and covered with symbols that most humans had forgotten how to read. "Commander." So Min followed behind him, her boots echoing in the narrow corridor. Her security clearance could open doors to weapons that could destroy entire solar systems, but she had never heard of Project Lazarus. She had never seen clearance codes that went beyond Alpha Black protocols. The very existence of these tunnels was news to Harry. "Still do not understand why this is so secret," she muttered as they walked deeper into the forgotten levels of the base. "What could be down here that requires this level of security?" Dr. Hai Jin walked ahead of them, her small frame moving with purpose through the maze of corridors. She had been quiet since the council meeting, speaking only when necessary. Her datapad glowed softly in the dim light, showing clearance codes that opened door after door. Each seal was more complex than the last, requiring biometric scans that went deeper than fingerprints or retinal patterns, because 300 years ago the council made us promise to never speak of what humans were like before we reached the stars. Hai Jin explained without turning around. "They helped us bury our history because they were terrified of what they saw." The tunnels grew narrower as they descended. The air recycling systems here were older, and the sound of machinery echoed strangely off the walls. Emergency lighting cast long shadows that seemed to move. When they were not looking, Jin Woo felt like they were walking into the basement of history itself, where all the things civilization wanted to forget were stored away. At the deepest level, they reached a chamber that was smaller than Jinwoo had expected. The room contained only a single data core surrounded by warning symbols in dozens of languages. Some of the symbols were human, but others belonged to species that had helped design this place. Warnings about dangerous information and forbidden knowledge covered every surface. In the center of the room sat an old man who looked like he had been there since the tunnels were first carved from the rock. His name was Taeho, and he was the keeper of the archive. His job was to guard the secrets that humanity had agreed to forget. He had not left this room in 50 years, and his eyes held the weight of knowledge that no one else was allowed to carry. "So it is time then," Taeho said without looking up from his meditation. His voice was quiet, but it carried the authority of someone who had seen the rise and fall of civilizations. Time to show them why Earth's application to join the Federation took 40 years to approve. The data core hummed to life as Tejo entered codes that had been sealed for 3 centuries. The air in the chamber seemed to thicken as holographic displays began to appear around them. Images from Earth's history projected themselves onto the walls, showing scenes that most humans had never seen. The alien observers who had been granted permission to witness this moment gasped as the first images appeared: wars that consumed entire continents, weapons that could end civilization, strategies that turned civilian populations into resources, technologies so brutal that most species could not understand their purpose. Elder Kethra had insisted on being present, despite the risks to her crystalline form. She floated near the back of the chamber, her body flickering with patterns that showed fear and fascination in equal measure. Your people fought like machines, she whispered as images of human warfare filled the air around them. No, Tejo corrected, his voice still calm despite the horror playing out in the holograms. Machines fight for logical reasons, resources, territory, survival. Humans fight because we refuse to stop fighting. Even when logic says we should surrender, even when mathematics proves we cannot win, humans keep fighting. The images shifted, showing battles where humans had been outnumbered 1,000 to 1, but had somehow found ways to turn defeat into victory. They showed siege warfare where humans had eaten their own dead rather than surrender. They showed weapons designed not just to kill enemies but to terrify them into submission. It is not rational, Tejo continued. It is not efficient. It is not civilized. It is just what we are. So Min stared at the displays with wide eyes, watching her own species commit acts that violated every principle of modern warfare. These are not the humans I know, she said softly. These are monsters, former monsters. Hai-Jin corrected, her voice heavy with the weight of buried guilt. The humans in these records chose to become something else. They formed the World Peace Council. They dismantled their war machines. They made a conscious decision to be better than what they had been. The final hologram showed Earth's last world war, a conflict so devastating that it had shocked humanity into permanent change. Cities reduced to glass by weapons that turned sand into atomic fire. Entire armies disappeared in chemical clouds that dissolved flesh from bone. Populations that had been turned into living weapons through biological modification. The war had ended not with victory or defeat, but with humanity's collective realization that they had become something too dangerous for their own good. The formation of the World Peace Council had been followed by decades of deliberate cultural change. Humans had chosen to forget how to make war and learn how to make peace instead. But the capacity remains, Hai-Jin said softly as the holograms faded back into the data core. Dormant, suppressed, controlled, but still there in our genetic memory, still there in our culture, hidden beneath 3 centuries of peaceful evolution. Tejo nodded slowly, his eyes reflecting the glow of the data core. The modifications we made to ourselves were not deletions, they were locks placed on doors that could still be opened. The knowledge is still there, the instincts are still there, the willingness to do anything to survive is still there, Commander. So Min looked around the chamber at the warning symbols and the sealed data core, at the old man who had spent his life guarding secrets that could damn or save the galaxy, at the woman who carried the keys to unlock what humanity had locked away. You think we should open those doors? She asked, though her voice suggested she already knew the answer. Tejo stood for the first time since they had entered the chamber. His movement was slow and careful, like someone who had spent decades sitting in the same position. When he spoke, his voice carried absolute certainty. The Devourers will be here in 6 months. They will consume every living thing in this system and then move on to consume whatever is left of the galaxy. We can die as the peaceful, civilized beings we chose to become, or we can become what we were before and maybe find a way to take them with us. Elder Kethra's crystalline form had grown dim with horror. You're talking about unleashing monsters on the universe, she said. What guarantee do we have that awakened humans will stop with the Devourers? None, Tejo replied without hesitation. No guarantee at all, but the Devourers offer certain death in 6 months. Awakened humans offer uncertain death in 6 years, or 60 years, or 600 years. Those who choose mathematics over hope will take the certain death. Those who choose hope over mathematics will take the uncertain one. The chamber fell silent except for the hum of the data core and the distant sound of life support systems keeping millions of refugees alive in their underground tomb. Jinwoo looked at the faces around him and saw the moment when hope and desperation finally outweighed fear and logic. The vote would be taken in the morning, but everyone in the chamber already knew what the decision would be. When survival was the only option left, morality became a luxury they could no longer afford. Within hours, the first volunteers would enter the awakening chambers, and humanity would remember what it meant to be human when civilization was just a word and survival was the only law that mattered.